Hi there, and welcome back to the channel. We've already uploaded a couple of Swift testing videos, and this video will also be about Swift testing. Instead of looking at the expect macro, which we looked at previously, where we could assert that certain conditions in our code were as expected, or that certain errors were thrown when we wanted them to be thrown, we're going to look at require now. And require is quite similar to expectation, but it's used for a different kind of use case. So throughout the video, we're going to look at how we can require certain pieces of state to be in a certain condition. We're also going to require that optional values exist rather than be nil. And lastly, we're going to take a look at how we can use expect and require together in some cases. And lastly, we'll also look at error handling with the require macro. So let's go ahead and dive right into a demo where we can see everything that we should know about expect and, in this case, mostly actually require. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, make sure you do that right now. Hit the notification bell, like the video, all these things. It makes me happy, it makes YouTube happy, and it's really just a win for everybody. So let's go on ahead and take a look at what require can do for us. So in this Xcode project, what I have is a couple of different files. It's my playground for all of my testing videos. And one of my files here is actually the require macro test. I also have a user info store, and that's what we're going to be writing a test for. We're going to require that we receive a user, and we're going to require that we have a valid value later on. So let me get started with the user info store testing. So what we'll actually do is we're going to go ahead and jump straight into writing a test, func can get stored user. And if we take a look at what the code here does, we can actually see that user info store has a private var users, it's a dictionary, we have a get user function, and we have an add user function. So with all of these functions, what we can actually go ahead and do is start testing them. So we can test that adding a user and then getting it back actually gets us a user. So let's go on ahead and make an instance of our user info store. So we'll go ahead and define a var called store equals an instance of our user info store. Then we'll actually create a user, and that's going to be the user that we want to store. Then I'll tell my store to add the user with the instance of a user that I just made. And then we're going to use an expectation, let's start with that, to make sure that we actually have a user. So we're going to expect that store get user with name equals my user expected to get the stored user. If we run this test, it's going to pass initially. All right, so we're going to build, we succeed, and then we're testing, and we should get a test passed. There we go, the test succeeded. Now let's imagine that this test was a little bit more complicated so that we could actually say, let stored user equals store.getUser. And we want to make sure that we got the right user. So if we're still using expect, we could be using something like this. There, and then we could, maybe if this was more complicated, have other assertions on our user, right? If we wanted to do that, it would not even make sense to run this if we did not get the right user, right? It would not make sense to continue with an incorrect user. So how do we actually make sure that we only run everything in our test suite if some condition is met? And that's where the require macro comes in. So if I, instead of expect that my stored user equals the received user, or the user that I wanted to store, if I don't expect that, but if I require that, what happens is we never get to everything else. So I could actually go ahead and say stored user dot name equals John, right? And we'll print that, or maybe we'll expect that. I don't know. And we'll make that name the name that we actually use, which is my name, like that. All right, so let's actually say that we wanted to do sort of a double check. Check that these two are equal and check that the name is actually Donnie. If I go back to using expect, and then I break my test, right? So instead of getting the user that was asked for, I'll return a user with name John. I'll put this behind comments. If I run my test now, what's going to happen is that my first expectation fails and my second expectation fails. And really there's no point in even running this when I know that I didn't get the right user. If I move this over to require, let's see what happens then. We'll go ahead, run the test. Build failed. Why is that? Call can throw. Yeah, that's right. Require can actually throw. So our function also needs to become a throwing one. Let's also make it async because why not? So there we go. Now notice that instead of running both of my checks, I'm only running the require. And because the require failed, it actually throws an error. And that's telling Swift testing that we should not proceed with this test because we don't have met, we haven't met our precondition. We haven't found the required value. So the key difference here that you just saw between require and expect is that require is truly a requirement. If we did not get back what we expected to get back, then we don't proceed with our test. This is really powerful because it makes it so that you don't have to add any guards and manually fill your test. You simply run it. If you must have something in order for your test to continue, you require it. If you just want to make sure that a value is there and it doesn't really matter whether it's there, you want to make sure that everything runs, you use expect. So require is very useful for those cases where it truly does not, and I can't repeat this enough, where it truly does not make sense for your test to continue if the value that you're waiting for wasn't there. Let me show you an example that's maybe a little bit more sensible by using optional checking with require. So if we take a look at the documentation for require, or just at the, well, yeah, here it is. Right, if we require something like an optional value, we can actually get that value out through our require macro. Right, so I'm going to use the require macro now to actually check that stored user is not nil. So I'm going to write let stored user equals try to require, and then we get this optional value here, and that's going to be store.getUser with name Donnie. And then we'll actually add a comment saying expected user to be stored. Now what I could actually do is expect that stored user's name equals Donnie, or I could compare it to the user object itself, whatever makes sense. So now we can run. We actually see that we did get a user back, but we didn't get the correct user back, right? So now this test is telling us a lot more. It's telling us you did get something. So there's a bug in your implementation for get user. If I were to return nil here, let's see what happens. We'll actually see that expectation failed. The store returned nil instead of my user, right? So that is very useful. We can actually see this expected user to be stored printed in our console. So let's make our implementation work again. We can run the test. So now the test actually succeeds. So we used require here to make sure that we got the value that we expected, and we used it to make sure that we could proceed with our test in a sensible way. It's really nice to be able to require optional values in this manner, because typically when you need an optional value to be non-nil, it kind of doesn't make sense to continue your test. Because if I got nil back from this, I know that this is not going to be true. There's no way that stored user's name is going to be Donnie if I didn't get a stored user in the first place. So that's where require comes in. We can also leverage this in tests that would expect errors to be thrown. So if we actually take a look at our expect tests for errors, so for example, if I take a look at this one right here, we can actually make sure that we get a value to small error, right? So I can go ahead And maybe we'll just copy this whole test. There we go. Like that. We'll put it in here. And so this test should work. And we'll actually change the name here so that things can actually compile. Now if we run this test, it should work like you might have seen in my previous video on expect. We can also replace this with require. Right? Any place where you use expect require is going to work, except you of course have to try your call to require rather than not trying. And so now our test actually succeeded, and that's great. Again, this is what you use if you have a requirement and you don't want to continue your test if the requirement isn't met. I'm not going to show you every single way that you can check errors in require. That's because it's the exact same as it is with expect. So I highly recommend that if you're not familiar with expect at all, that you take a look at my video on expect. And with that, I think you should be able to start using require in your tests. So to recap, in this video, we saw how the require macro can be used to ensure that certain preconditions are met for our test, if and only if it does not make sense for our test to continue if the prerequisite isn't met. You can use this on Boolean conditions, just like you can expect, and you can also use this in optionals. And for me, that's the place where I use this most, on optionals. Right? I want to make sure that my value is there, that it's not nil, and it truly doesn't make sense to continue my test if that value that I expected to exist actually doesn't exist. So then I use require. We could also use require for errors to see if we got the error that we expected in the exact same way that we use the expect macro. So there's two tools really in the Swift testing framework that we can use for our assertions. One is expect, where we say, test that this is true, and if it's not, that's okay, just continue running the test. I want to collect every single test failure and then fix everything all at once. With require, you're basically saying it doesn't really make sense for the test to continue if this one condition is false. I know that if this one thing does not work, or if I don't get a value back, in this case from our user store, I know that everything I'm going to do after won't work anyway, so we're going to require this so that our test fails early and with a very clear error message. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, make sure to like the video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.